Terrible mistake, when the police beat a respected official. In the dim light of a cold autumn evening, the city of Westbridge buzzed quietly with the hum of cars and the flicker of street lamps. Officer Daniel Harper, a 12-year veteran of the Westbridge Police Department, had spent most of his career avoiding trouble. Known for his calm demeanor and excellent record, Daniel had never been the kind to act impulsively. He followed the rules, knew the law inside out, and believed in justice. But that night was different. The air felt thick with tension as he patrolled the desolate streets of downtown. The night shift was always quieter, but tonight there was an edge, something almost imperceptible. Daniel could feel it in his bones, that unexplainable sixth sense that told him something was about to go wrong. It was around midnight when the call came through his radio. Suspicious activity near the Civic Hall, the dispatcher said, voice flat and routine. All available units, please respond. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing. Civic Hall wasn't a typical trouble spot. It was home to the offices of the city's elite, government officials, and lawyers who worked long hours, crafting policies and making decisions that shaped the city. It was the last place he expected a break-in or any kind of disturbance. But in a city like Westbridge, surprises were never far away. His cruiser cut through the empty streets, red and blue lights casting fleeting shadows across the buildings. When he arrived at Civic Hall, the area was unnervingly quiet. He parked a short distance away, stepping out of the car with his hand resting on the holster of his gun, out of habit more than fear. The stone facade of the hall loomed ahead, and under the soft yellow glow of the street lamps, Daniel saw a figure near the entrance. The man's posture was hunched, as if he were trying to stay hidden. Instinctively, Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving, and that small moments of hesitation could be costly. "Police!" Daniel shouted as he approached. The figure didn't move. His mind raced. Was this a drunk who had wandered off from the nearby bars, or someone with more dangerous intentions? Daniel closed the distance, his steps cautious, his eyes scanning for any sign of a weapon. "Sir, I need you to step away from the building." The man straightened but still didn't speak. His face was obscured in the shadows, and Daniel could barely make out his features. His instincts, sharpened by years of training, screamed at him that something wasn't right. He reached for his radio, but before he could make a call for backup, the man made a sudden, jerking movement toward his jacket. Adrenaline surged through Daniel. In a split second, his mind went into overdrive, and without thinking, he lunged forward. His training took over, and he tackled the man to the ground with force, pinning him down. The man struggled beneath him, and Daniel, consumed by the rush of the moment, reacted as he had been taught in countless scenarios. He struck the man to subdue him, ensuring that he wouldn't pose a threat. The man groaned in pain, his hands flailing in weak resistance, but Daniel tightened his grip, determined to maintain control of the situation. It was only after a few long seconds of silence, after the struggle had ceased, that Daniel finally allowed himself to look down, to take in the face of the man beneath him. His heart dropped into his stomach. The man wasn't a criminal, wasn't a vagrant or a would-be assailant. The face staring back at him, blood trickling from a cut above the brow, was all too familiar. It was Thomas Whitman, the deputy mayor of Westbridge. The respected official, known for his clean record, his work in the community, and his close ties to the police department itself. Whitman lay beneath Daniel, his expression a mix of pain, confusion, and betrayal. Daniel stumbled back, his hands shaking as the full weight of what he had just done hit him. This wasn't supposed to happen. It couldn't be happening. He blinked, trying to steady his breath, trying to comprehend how things had gone so wrong so fast. "Whitman?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. He could already hear the distant sound of approaching sirens, backup, arriving too late. Whitman groaned, clutching his side as he tried to sit up. Daniel knelt beside him, torn between instinctively offering help and knowing that he had caused the injury in the first place. You attacked me," Whitman gasped, his voice hoarse, still in shock. "I didn't know. I thought," Daniel began, but his words died in his throat. There was no justification that could erase what had just happened. Within minutes, other officers arrived on the scene, their faces mirroring the disbelief that Daniel himself felt. Medical personnel rushed in to assist Whitman, while Daniel stood there, frozen in place, feeling the walls of his life start to close in around him. He had crossed a line that no apology could fix. The radio crackled with the sound of updates, but Daniel barely heard it. His fellow officers exchanged hushed whispers as they pieced together what had unfolded. The rumors would spread quickly. Officer Daniel Harper had just assaulted the deputy mayor. There was no coming back from that. By morning, the news would explode across every media outlet in the city. Headlines would scream about police brutality, a mistake that would fuel outrage and calls for reform. The department would face scrutiny, protests would erupt, and the delicate relationship between law enforcement and the citizens of Westbridge would be irreparably damaged. And in the middle of it all was Daniel, a man who had once believed in the righteousness of his actions, now staring into the abyss of his own career, wondering if there would be any way to salvage what little remained. The consequences were not just personal. What Daniel had done would send shockwaves through the entire justice system. Investigations would begin, not only into his actions but into the very fabric of the police force itself. Had they been too quick to act? Too reliant on force over communication? The media would ask questions, and so would the public. The outcry would be deafening. And Daniel? He would have to live with the knowledge that one split-second decision, one terrible mistake, had changed everything. The life he had known was over. The badge, the honor, the respect he had earned, they were all slipping away, as elusive as the night had been when he made the worst mistake of his life. Daniel stood in stunned silence, his legs heavy as if anchored to the ground beneath him. The chaotic sounds of the scene, the distant wail of sirens, the hurried footsteps of arriving officers, the chatter on police radios, felt like they were happening in another world. His mind was frozen on the face of Thomas Whitman, now lying on the ground, grimacing in pain. What had he done? One of the paramedics crouched beside Whitman, checking his pulse and murmuring reassurances, though the official's eyes never left Daniel. There was no mistaking the look in Whitman's gaze: anger, shock, and, worst of all, betrayal. Daniel had known the deputy mayor for years. Whitman had been one of the few in city leadership who advocated for better funding and support for the police department, who had tried to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. And now, in an instant, Daniel had shattered that fragile bond. As Daniel watched, his hands still trembling, Officer Kelly approached him. Kelly had been on the force almost as long as Daniel, a steady presence known for her level-headedness in times of crisis. But the expression on her face now wasn't one of calm, it was one of disbelief. "Daniel," she said softly, keeping her voice low so as not to draw the attention of the other officers milling about. "What the hell happened here?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he even begin to explain? How could he tell her that he had acted on instinct, that he had thought Whitman was a threat, that it all had happened so fast? "I didn't know it was him," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice sounding hollow in his own ears. "I thought." Kelly held up a hand, cutting him off. Her face was pale, and Daniel could see the concern in her eyes. "You need to stop talking. The captain's on his way, and the internal affairs team is already setting up an investigation. You're going to need a lawyer, Daniel. This is bad. Bad." The word felt like an understatement. It didn't capture the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding before him. Daniel had made a mistake, but it was no ordinary error. It was the kind of mistake that could ruin careers, end lives. He wasn't just a cop who had messed up. He was now the officer who had assaulted a high-ranking government official, and the ramifications were going to be felt throughout the entire city. As Kelly stepped away to brief the arriving officers, Daniel's gaze returned to Whitman, who was now being lifted onto a stretcher. The deputy mayor winced in pain, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. There was no sympathy in Whitman's stare, no understanding. Daniel couldn't blame him. The media storm hit the next morning, as expected. By 7 a.m., every major news outlet in Westbridge had the story on their front pages, the headlines splashed with inflammatory language: police brutality or honest mistake, deputy mayor hospitalized after brutal attack by officer, public trust in police shattered by shocking assault. As Daniel sat in his small apartment, staring at the television in disbelief, he could feel the walls closing in around him. The coverage was relentless. Reporters stood outside the hospital where Whitman was recovering, offering live updates on his condition, while pundits debated the future of law enforcement in the city. Talk of protests filled the airwaves, with activists already calling for demonstrations outside City Hall that evening. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly, texts from friends, family, fellow officers, all offering a mix of support and cautious questions. But there was one call he had been dreading, and it came shortly after noon. The police department's legal representative, Sergeant Barnes, was on the other end, and his tone left no room for pleasantries. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave, Harper," Barnes said without preamble. "Pending the outcome of the investigation, you're not to report to the station or engage in any police activities. I strongly recommend you get a lawyer, and fast." Daniel's heart sank. Administrative leave was expected, but hearing it said aloud made the situation feel even more real. His career, everything he had worked for, was now in the hands of the department's Internal Affairs Division. He had seen other officers go through investigations before, and it was never good. Even if they found that his actions were justified, the stigma of this incident would follow him forever. "I understand," Daniel replied quietly. There wasn't much else to say. Barnes paused, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might offer some word of encouragement, but instead, the sergeant simply sighed. "This is going to be tough, Harper. Whitman's a powerful man, and there's already pressure from the mayor's office to make an example out of this. You need to prepare yourself for what's coming." The protests started small but grew in intensity as the week went on. At first, it was just a handful of people outside City Hall, activists holding signs, shouting slogans about police accountability and justice for the deputy mayor. But as the news spread, so did the anger. By the weekend, hundreds had gathered in the streets, chanting for reform, for resignations, for change. Daniel watched from the sidelines, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop the tidal wave of outrage. The city had been simmering with tension for months, years even, over issues of police conduct, and now his mistake had lit the match that threatened to burn everything down. In the eyes of the public, Daniel was already guilty. The video of Whitman being loaded onto a stretcher had gone viral, circulated endlessly on social media with captions condemning police violence. Commentators dissected every detail of the incident, though none of them knew what had truly happened in those frantic moments. As the investigation dragged on, Daniel became a ghost in his own life. He no longer wore the badge, no longer drove the streets of Westbridge in his cruiser. His days were consumed by meetings with lawyers, interviews with internal affairs, and endless hours of waiting to see if his career was over, waiting to see if he would face criminal charges, waiting for the city he loved to turn its back on him completely. It wasn't just his career on the line anymore. The media coverage had spiraled into a full-blown crisis for the police department. Public trust in law enforcement, already fragile, was crumbling, and every officer in the city was feeling the heat. Protests became more frequent, more volatile. Some turned violent, with clashes between demonstrators and riot police making headlines across the nation. Behind closed doors, the city's leaders scrambled to contain the damage. The mayor held emergency meetings with the police chief, the city council, and even representatives from the governor's office. They knew that how they handled Daniel's case would set a precedent, one that could either restore some semblance of order or tear the city apart. Months passed, and Daniel found himself in a courtroom, facing the consequences of that fateful night. The trial was a media spectacle, with cameras flashing and reporters lining the hallways, hungry for any scrap of information. Whitman took the stand, his testimony calm and measured. He recounted the night in detail, describing how he had been leaving a late-night meeting at the Civic Hall when Daniel approached him, mistaking him for a threat. There was no malice in Whitman's voice, but the facts were damning enough. A high-ranking official had been attacked by a police officer, and no amount of justification could erase the damage. The trial became a referendum on the entire police force. Witnesses came forward to speak about their experiences with law enforcement in Westbridge, some positive, others painting a picture of systemic issues that went far beyond Daniel's actions. Activists and community leaders seized the moment, calling for sweeping reforms, while Daniel sat quietly, his future hanging in the balance. In the end, the verdict came down swiftly. Guilty. Daniel's heart sank as the words echoed through the courtroom. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. He had made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake, and now he would pay the price. As he was led away in handcuffs, the cameras clicked, capturing the final image of a man who had once believed in the system, now brought down by it. The protests outside the courthouse erupted into cheers, but Daniel didn't hear them. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of that night, replaying every decision, every action, every moment that had led him to this point. He would spend the next several years in prison, a fallen officer, a cautionary tale for future generations. And outside, the city of Westbridge would continue to grapple with the consequences of his mistake, the fragile line between justice and chaos forever blurred. Daniel sat in the prison transport van, his wrists shackled to the cold metal bench beneath him. The hum of the engine filled the silence, drowning out the murmurs of the other prisoners as they were shuffled to their destinations. The weight of the handcuffs, the sterile smell of the prison uniform, the rhythmic jostling of the vehicle as it moved through the streets of Westbridge, all of it felt surreal. It was as if he were watching his own life from a distance, detached, unable to process how it had come to this. He had once worn a uniform of authority, a badge that represented justice. Now, he was the one in chains, awaiting a fate that had already been decided. The city had turned its back on him. The department that had been his second family now saw him as a disgrace. And the justice system, the very one he had sworn to uphold, had cast him aside. But the worst part was the silence. The deafening silence that followed the chaos of the trial. The media storm had moved on, focusing on other stories, other controversies. The protests, once raging, had fizzled out after the trial, leaving only the occasional news article about police reform. The city of Westbridge had moved on from Daniel Harper, and he was left alone to face the consequences of his actions. Inside the prison, Daniel quickly learned the unspoken rules of survival. He wasn't the only ex-cop in there. There were others, scattered throughout the facility, keeping their heads down, trying to blend in with the general population. But it wasn't easy. The inmates knew who he was, what he had done, and many harbored a deep hatred for the police. From the first day, Daniel kept to himself, avoiding unnecessary confrontations. He wasn't there to make friends, just to survive his sentence and somehow find a way to live with the guilt that gnawed at him every waking moment. But prison life had a way of dragging you into conflicts whether you wanted them or not. It wasn't long before word spread through the prison that Daniel Harper, the former police officer who had beaten the deputy mayor, was housed in their midst. The looks he received in the cafeteria, the muttered threats as he walked past groups of inmates in the yard, they were reminders that he was a marked man. Ex-cops were always targets in prison, and his high-profile case only made things worse. One afternoon, about 6 months into his sentence, Daniel found himself cornered in the recreation yard by a group of 3 inmates, their faces hard, their eyes gleaming with malice. He had known this moment would come eventually. The leader, a tall, muscular man with tattoos snaking up his neck, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You think you can just walk around here like you're one of us, huh?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You cops are all the same. You think you're better than everyone else. But in here? You're just another piece of meat." Daniel didn't respond. He knew better than to engage. In prison, words could ignite violence, and he wasn't looking for a fight. But the leader wasn't interested in hearing silence. He shoved Daniel hard, sending him stumbling backward into the wall of the recreation yard. The other 2 inmates moved in closer, surrounding him. "Bet it felt good, huh?" the leader hissed, leaning in. "Beating down some helpless old man. Bet you got a real kick out of it. But now you're in here with us." let's see how tough you are without that badge." Daniel's heart raced. His body tensed, ready for the inevitable attack. He had been in plenty of brawls as a cop, but this was different. This wasn't about enforcing the law or protecting himself. This was about survival. Just as the leader raised his fist, a voice cut through the tension. "Back off." The group of inmates turned as a prison guard approached, hand on his baton, eyes narrowed in warning. The leader hesitated, then spat on the ground before backing away, motioning for his men to follow. "This ain't over, cop," he muttered as he walked away, leaving Daniel alone, breathing heavily, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The guard, a middle-aged man with a stern face, gave Daniel a curt nod. "You need to watch your back in here, Harper. You don't get special treatment just because you were one of us." Daniel nodded, but inside, he knew that he had no allies here. He was on his own, a former cop trying to navigate a world where every move could be his last. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the city of Westbridge continued to grapple with the aftermath of Daniel's case. The protests that had initially erupted after the incident had faded, but the underlying tensions between the community and the police remained. City officials scrambled to address the calls for reform, but change came slowly, and many citizens felt that justice had not been fully served. Thomas Whitman, the deputy mayor who had been at the center of the storm, had recovered from his injuries, but he had withdrawn from public life. The once charismatic leader, known for his dedication to civic service, now kept a low profile, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. Though his political career wasn't officially over, the incident had left its mark on him, both physically and emotionally. In quiet moments, Whitman would find himself replaying that night in his mind, just as Daniel did. He remembered the fear, the confusion, and the pain. But most of all, he remembered the look in Daniel's eyes when it was all over, the look of a man who had realized, too late, that he had made an unforgivable mistake. Whitman had been approached by lawyers, activists, and political figures, all urging him to take a stronger stand against police violence, to use his platform to push for radical change. But Whitman resisted. He wasn't a man of extremes, and though he had every reason to be angry, he couldn't bring himself to vilify the entire police force for the actions of one man. He had seen the good that officers like Daniel could do, and he knew that the problem was bigger than just one incident. Still, the city demanded action. And so, under pressure from both the public and his fellow politicians, Whitman reluctantly agreed to oversee a new task force dedicated to police reform. The task force's goal was to review the policies and procedures of the Westbridge Police Department and recommend changes to prevent future incidents like the one that had nearly ended Whitman's life. As the task force held meetings, heard testimony, and debated potential reforms, the divide between the police and the community deepened. Officers felt abandoned, under attack from the very people they were sworn to protect, while citizens felt that the police were no longer accountable to anyone. In the middle of it all, Daniel's name became a symbol, a rallying cry for both sides. To some, he represented the dangers of unchecked police power, the human cost of a broken system. To others, he was a scapegoat, a good cop who had made a mistake but was being punished too harshly for it. Months turned into years, and Daniel's time in prison dragged on. He kept his head down, avoided trouble, and spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. He knew he had made a terrible mistake that night. He had acted out of fear, out of instinct, and it had cost him everything. But what haunted Daniel most wasn't the loss of his career, or even the time he was serving in prison. It was the knowledge that his actions had shattered the trust between the police and the people they were meant to protect. He had been part of a system that, in some ways, had failed both him and the community. And now, he was paying the price for that failure. One day, after nearly 3 years behind bars, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. It was Thomas Whitman. Daniel had never expected to see Whitman again, much less in a place like this. But as they sat across from each other in the sterile prison visitation room, there was no anger in Whitman's eyes, only a quiet sadness. "I didn't come here for revenge," Whitman said softly, his hands folded on the table between them. "I've had plenty of time to think about that night, and I know you didn't mean to hurt me. But that doesn't change what happened. it doesn't change what's happening in the city. Daniel nodded, unsure of what to say. He had spent countless hours imagining what he would say if he ever had the chance to apologize to Whitman, but now that the moment was here, the words felt inadequate. "I'm sorry," Daniel finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never wanted any of this to happen. I made a mistake, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life." Whitman studied Daniel for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I know. And I don't hold a grudge against you, Daniel. But the system that put you in that position, that's what needs to change." They sat in silence for a while longer, two men whose lives had been irrevocably altered by a single night. When Whitman finally stood to leave, he offered Daniel a brief, solemn nod before walking away. As the door closed behind him, Daniel felt a strange sense of closure, though he knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult. Whitman's words lingered in his mind, a reminder that while his personal redemption might be out of reach, there was still hope for something greater, a chance to fix the broken system that had failed them both. After Whitman's visit, the days seemed to blend into one another, but something inside Daniel had shifted. The brief meeting with the deputy mayor had been unexpected, and though it hadn't erased the weight of his guilt, it had given him a new perspective. Daniel now understood that the fallout from his mistake was much bigger than himself. The fracture in the trust between the community and law enforcement was deep, and Whitman had made it clear that the problem wasn't just individual bad decisions, it was systemic. In the quiet hours, Daniel began to think more about what it meant to be a part of that system. He had spent years as a cop, believing in the righteousness of his job, of protecting and serving the people of Westbridge. But in the process, he had become blind to the ways in which the system could also oppress, could crush the very people it was meant to protect. His mistake had been the catalyst for change, but now that change needed to be bigger than his personal redemption. Months passed, and the reforms Whitman had been spearheading started to take shape. The task force's recommendations included mandatory de-escalation training for officers, the implementation of body cameras on every officer in the city, and the creation of an independent oversight committee to investigate complaints of police misconduct. These reforms were aimed at preventing future incidents like Daniel's from happening again, and while some hailed the measures as long overdue, others, especially within the police department, saw them as an attack on their ability to do their jobs. The Westbridge Police Department, already under intense scrutiny, was struggling to adapt. Morale within the ranks plummeted. Officers felt abandoned by both the public and the administration. They were caught between the expectation to maintain law and order and the growing hostility from the very communities they were tasked with serving. Protests had quieted, but the tension remained palpable, like a slow-burning fire that could reignite at any moment. For Daniel, the knowledge that these changes were happening outside the prison walls brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved that something good might come from his terrible mistake. But on the other, he couldn't help but feel like he had become the symbol of everything wrong with policing. The pressure to make an example of him weighed heavily on his mind. He knew that, to some, he was a scapegoat, a singular face representing the failures of an entire system. About 4 years into his sentence, Daniel's lawyer came to visit him with surprising news. "They're considering early parole," she said, sitting across from him in the dimly lit visitation room. Daniel's brow furrowed in disbelief. "Parole? I thought there was no chance of that. My case was too high profile." The lawyer nodded, acknowledging his skepticism. "That's true, but things have changed. The public's attention has shifted to other issues, and with the reforms in place, there's been some movement on cases like yours. It's not a guarantee, but there's a strong possibility you could be released early for good behavior." Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. Early parole. The thought of leaving prison, of stepping back into the world outside, felt unreal. For so long, he had resigned himself to his fate, to paying for his mistake in full. The idea of freedom, of having another chance to rebuild his life, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "What happens if I get out?" he asked quietly. "What then? The city still hates me. The department, they won't want me back. I've got nothing left out there." The lawyer leaned forward, her eyes softening. "It won't be easy, Daniel. You know that. But you won't be starting from zero. You have people who care about you, and more importantly, you've had time to reflect on everything that's happened. If you get out, you'll have a chance to rebuild, to contribute in new ways." She paused, letting her words sink in before adding, "And maybe, just maybe, you can help from the outside. The system is changing, but there's still a lot of work to be done. You could be part of that change, even if it's not as a cop." The day of Daniel's parole hearing arrived, and the courtroom was far less crowded than it had been during his trial years earlier. The media had moved on, and the public's interest in his case had waned. Still, as Daniel sat before the parole board, he felt the same tight knot of anxiety in his stomach, the same fear that had gripped him during the trial. The board members asked their questions, probing into his behavior in prison, his reflections on the incident, and his plans for the future. Daniel answered as honestly as he could, acknowledging his mistakes without trying to excuse them. He spoke of his guilt, his regrets, and the lessons he had learned about the fragility of trust between the police and the community. When the questioning was over, the board deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Finally, they returned with their decision. Mr. Harper, the lead board member, said, her expression neutral but firm. "We've considered your case carefully, and we believe that you have shown genuine remorse and a commitment to self-improvement. Therefore, we are granting you early parole, effective immediately." The words washed over Daniel, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he had heard them correctly. Early parole. He was free. Adjusting to life outside of prison was harder than Daniel had anticipated. The world had moved on without him, and he was no longer the man he had been before his arrest. He kept a low profile, moving to a quiet part of the city where he wouldn't be recognized. He took up work at a community center, where he spent his days helping at-risk youth and organizing programs aimed at bridging the divide between the police and the community. It was a strange twist of fate. Daniel, the former cop who had once been part of the system, now working alongside the very people who had protested against it. He didn't talk much about his past, but the kids at the center knew who he was. Some of them were wary of him at first, but over time, they began to see that he wasn't there to judge them or enforce the law. He was there to listen, to help, and to try, in his own small way, to make up for his mistakes. One evening, as Daniel was locking up the community center, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was Thomas Whitman. The former deputy mayor had aged in the years since their last meeting, his hair now streaked with gray, but his presence was as commanding as ever. He approached Daniel with a small smile. "I heard you were working here," Whitman said, his voice carrying a note of approval. "It's good to see you again." Daniel nodded, a mixture of surprise and gratitude welling up inside him. "You too, Whitman. What brings you here?" Whitman shrugged lightly, glancing around the community center. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I've been keeping an eye on the work you've been doing here. It's important, you know, what you're doing. These kids need someone who understands both sides of the fence." Daniel appreciated the sentiment, though he still struggled with the idea that anything he did now could truly make up for what had happened. "I'm just trying to help," he said quietly. "Trying to make things right, in whatever way I can." Whitman studied him for a long moment before nodding. "That's all any of us can do, Daniel. Make things right, one step at a time." The years went by, and Westbridge slowly adapted to its new reality. The reforms instituted after Daniel's case remained in place, and while there were still challenges, there was a growing sense of accountability within the police force. The Oversight Committee had gained traction, and officers were more mindful of their interactions with the public. Trust between the community and law enforcement was still fragile, but it was being rebuilt, piece by piece. For Daniel, life became about quiet redemption. He never returned to the police force. He knew that chapter of his life was closed for good, but he found purpose in his work at the community center. He became a mentor to the youth, helping them navigate the complexities of their lives, and in doing so, he found a way to heal some of the wounds that had been inflicted by his actions. In the end, Daniel Harper became a symbol of something unexpected. not of failure or disgrace, but of the possibility of change, both personal and systemic. His story was one of pain and regret, but also of hope. The city of Westbridge had been shaken to its core by his mistake, but it had also found a path forward, toward a more just and accountable future. Years passed, and Daniel Harper's life settled into a quiet routine. The community center had become his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the day-to-day tasks that kept him grounded. Though the memories of that fateful night never fully left him, they became more like shadows, always present, but no longer overwhelming his every thought. The city of Westbridge, too, had found a kind of equilibrium. The reforms enacted after the incident with Whitman had been institutionalized, and while tensions still simmered beneath the surface, the open conflict between law enforcement and the public had subsided. The police force had been restructured, with new leadership and a stronger focus on transparency and community engagement. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being rebuilt, though everyone understood that it was a fragile thing, easily broken again if care was not taken. Daniel had kept his distance from most of the officers he had once called colleagues. His time in prison had severed many of those relationships, and there was an unspoken understanding that his return to civilian life would not include a re-entry into the Brotherhood of the Badge. Still, from time to time, he would catch glimpses of familiar faces at city events or community meetings, nodding in silent acknowledgement of the shared history they all carried. One morning, as Daniel was preparing for a youth workshop at the community center, he received a phone call that would change the course of his life once again. The voice on the other end was soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. "Daniel, it's Thomas Whitman." Though they had seen each other a few times over the years, Whitman's call was unexpected. There was a brief pause before the former deputy mayor spoke again. "I need your help." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "What's going on?" Whitman sighed, the weight of his words heavy with tension. "It's about the police department. There's been an incident." The word incident sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He had learned, over time, that such language was often a euphemism for something far worse. "What kind of incident?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "A shooting. It's bad, Daniel. There's already protests starting up, and the city's on edge again. They need someone who understands both sides. Someone who can help calm things down." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the gravity of Whitman's request. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the reforms would prevent something like this from happening again. But now, reality was crashing back down, reminding him that the line between peace and chaos was thinner than he had ever realized. "Why me?" Daniel asked finally, his voice quiet but steady. Whitman's response was immediate. "Because you've lived it. You know what it's like on both sides of this issue. People still remember what happened with us, but they also know that you've worked hard to make amends. If anyone can talk to the cops, the community, and the media, it's you." There was a long pause as Daniel considered what was being asked of him. He had spent years trying to atone for his mistakes, to find a way to contribute without stepping back into the world of law enforcement. But now, Whitman was offering him a chance to do something more, to be a bridge between the police and the people, to help heal the wounds that had never fully closed. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "You are," Whitman said firmly. "We need you, Daniel." 2 days later, Daniel found himself standing in front of a room full of police officers, city officials, and community leaders. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the recent shooting hanging over everyone like a storm cloud. Outside, the protests had grown louder, with demonstrators filling the streets, demanding justice, accountability, and reform. The city was on the verge of boiling over, and Daniel could feel the anxiety in every set of eyes watching him. He had agreed to speak at Whitman's urging, but now, as he stood at the podium, he felt a familiar sense of dread creeping in. The memory of his own mistake loomed large in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was truly the right person to address the situation. But then he thought about the years he had spent working with the kids at the community center, about the conversations he'd had with young people who were scared of the police, who felt abandoned and unheard. He thought about the officers he had known, good men and women who had tried their best but were caught in a system that often failed them. And he thought about Whitman, how they had both been victims of a broken system, but had also been given a second chance to make things right. Taking a deep breath, Daniel began to speak. "I know what it's like to be where you are right now," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what it's like to be on the front lines, making split-second decisions that can change lives. And I know what it's like to make a mistake, one that you can't take back, no matter how much you wish you could." He paused, looking around the room, letting his words sink in. "But I also know that we have a responsibility. To the people we serve. To the communities we protect. And to ourselves. We have to do better. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only way we can heal the damage that's been done." There was a murmur of agreement from some in the room, though others remained silent, their faces hard with skepticism. Daniel knew that not everyone would be on board with what he was saying, but that didn't deter him. "We've made progress," he continued. "The reforms that were put in place after my case, those were a step in the right direction. But they're not enough. We need to keep pushing, keep changing, until every person in this city feels safe. Until every officer knows they have the training and the support they need to do their jobs without fear of making a fatal mistake." Daniel's eyes swept the room, locking onto faces he recognized from his days on the force. "This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about fixing a system that's broken. And I'm here to help, however I can." When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment, and Daniel wasn't sure how his words had been received. But then, one by one, people began to nod in agreement. A few of the officers even approached him afterward, quietly thanking him for his honesty and offering their support. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became an unexpected voice in the ongoing dialogue about policing in Westbridge. He attended community meetings, spoke at protests, and worked with both the police department and activists to find common ground. His unique position, having been both a cop and a convict, gave him a perspective that few others had, and people began to listen. It wasn't easy. The wounds in Westbridge ran deep, and there were no simple solutions. But Daniel had learned, through his own journey, that real change took time and patience. He wasn't naive enough to think that one person could fix everything, but he believed in the power of dialogue, of listening, and of working together toward a shared goal. As the city slowly began to recover from the latest crisis, Daniel found a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer running from his past, but embracing it as part of his story, a story that wasn't over yet. Years later, long after the protests had quieted and the reforms had taken root, Daniel Harper would be remembered not just as the cop who made a terrible mistake, but as the man who had helped Westbridge heal. His journey from disgrace to redemption wasn't a perfect one, but it was real. And in the end, that was enough. He had found his place, not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who had learned from his mistakes and used those lessons to help others. As Daniel Harper's role in Westbridge deepened, he became a reluctant yet prominent figure in the broader conversation about justice reform. His story, of redemption, accountability, and reform, spread far beyond the city, reaching national attention. Journalists and activists from other parts of the country started to approach him, seeking his perspective on policing, the justice system, and how communities could heal after tragedy. Yet for Daniel, the spotlight was never comfortable. He didn't want to be seen as a hero, nor did he believe that his actions had somehow made up for the mistakes of his past. He carried the weight of what he had done every day, and while he had found ways to contribute meaningfully, he knew that the scars of his past would always linger. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment, reflecting on the unexpected trajectory his life had taken. The city outside was quieter now than it had been in years, the streets no longer filled with protests and clashes between police and citizens. But there was still tension, simmering just beneath the surface. The reforms had helped, but Daniel knew that the underlying problems were more complex than just new policies or oversight committees. There was a deep, generational mistrust between the police and the people, and no amount of legislation could fix that overnight. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. When he opened it, he found Thomas Whitman standing on the other side. "Thomas," Daniel said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." Whitman smiled softly. "I know. I didn't call ahead because I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Daniel stepped aside, letting the former deputy mayor in. Whitman had aged noticeably in the years since the incident that had first connected them. His once sharp eyes were now a bit dulled by time, and his movements were slower, more deliberate. "Have a seat," Daniel offered, gesturing toward the worn-out couch in the living room. Whitman sat down, taking a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through, Daniel. About the city, the reforms, and you." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unsure where this conversation was going. "What about me?" Whitman's gaze was thoughtful, almost introspective. "I've been asked to run for mayor." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Daniel blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected this. Whitman had always been a respected figure in the community, but his involvement in the controversial events of the past had cast a long shadow over his political future. The fact that he was now considering running for the highest office in Westbridge seemed almost surreal. "And you want my opinion?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair. Whitman nodded. "You've seen what this city is capable of. The good and the bad. You know the challenges we still face. I've been out of the game for a while, but I think there's more I can do. But I need to know if I can count on your support." Daniel considered the request. He and Whitman had been through so much together, their fates intertwined by a single moment of violence and its aftermath. He respected Whitman's commitment to reform, but he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Running for mayor would mean stepping back into the political fray, and it would bring their past mistakes back into the public eye. "I don't know, Thomas," Daniel said after a long pause. "This city, it's changed, but not enough. There's still a lot of anger out there, and not just about what happened between us. People don't trust politicians, and they sure don't trust the police. You running for mayor might stir up old wounds." Whitman nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know. But I also think that's why it's important. We can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. We've made progress, but the work isn't done." Daniel looked down at his hands, the calloused fingers that had once clenched around the handle of a baton, now softer from years spent mentoring troubled youth. He had always believed in the idea of redemption, but he also knew that redemption wasn't something you could achieve alone. It required the support of others, and it required a commitment to keep moving forward, even when the path was difficult. "If you're serious about this," Daniel said finally, "then I'll support you. But you have to be ready for what's coming. People will dig up the past, and it won't be easy." Whitman smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm ready, Daniel. I've been ready for a long time." The campaign began a few months later, and as expected, it wasn't without controversy. Whitman's opponents dredged up his involvement in the incident with Daniel, painting him as a figure who had failed to protect the city when it needed leadership the most. They argued that his reforms had gone too far, weakening the police force and putting the city at risk. At the same time, some activists criticized him for not doing enough to dismantle the systemic issues that still plagued Westbridge. But Whitman was undeterred. He ran on a platform of continued reform and community rebuilding, emphasizing accountability, transparency, and justice. He spoke about the need for real dialogue between the police and the people, and he pointed to the work that Daniel had done as proof that change was possible. Throughout the campaign, Daniel found himself in an unusual position. He wasn't a politician, nor did he have any desire to become one, but his name had become synonymous with the movement for police reform in Westbridge. His story, once a cautionary tale, had evolved into something else, an example of how individuals could change, and how systems could be forced to adapt when enough pressure was applied. Daniel attended campaign events, sometimes speaking to small crowds about his experiences, other times standing quietly in the background while Whitman made his case. He knew that his presence was symbolic, and while he still felt uncomfortable in the public eye, he also recognized the importance of being there. People needed to see that he hadn't disappeared after the headlines had faded, that he was still committed to the cause. Election night came, and the results were closer than anyone had anticipated. Whitman's message had resonated with many in the city, but there was still a strong undercurrent of resistance from those who believed that his reforms had gone too far. Daniel sat with Whitman in a modest campaign office, surrounded by a small group of supporters and volunteers. The mood was tense as the final results trickled in, each precinct bringing new numbers that tilted the race one way or another. Finally, just after midnight, the announcement came. Whitman had won by a narrow margin, securing the position of mayor by just a few hundred votes. The room erupted into cheers, but Daniel remained seated, watching as Whitman embraced his team and thanked them for their hard work. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, a sense of accomplishment after months of grueling effort. But Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. The real work would come in the months and years ahead, as Whitman tried to implement the changes he had promised. As the celebration continued around him, Whitman approached Daniel, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Whitman said simply. Daniel nodded, standing up to shake his hand. "The hard part's just beginning, you know that." Whitman chuckled, though his expression was serious. "I do. But we'll face it together." In the years that followed, Westbridge continued its slow but steady transformation. Whitman's administration pushed forward with new initiatives aimed at fostering trust between the police and the community. Daniel remained a key figure in these efforts, serving as an unofficial advisor to the mayor and continuing his work at the community center. The city wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of conflict and frustration. But there was also progress, real, measurable progress. The police force became more diverse, more accountable, and more engaged with the neighborhoods they served. The community, in turn, began to see the police not as an occupying force, but as partners in the effort to keep Westbridge safe and just. Daniel, for his part, found a kind of peace in his work. He had stopped searching for redemption long ago, realizing that it wasn't something that could be achieved in a single moment or through a single act. Instead, it was a process, one that required constant reflection, effort, and humility. As the years passed, Daniel became more comfortable with the idea that his life had meaning beyond the mistake that had once defined him. He was still haunted by the memory of that night, but he no longer allowed it to control him. He had found his place in the world, not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who had learned from his past and dedicated himself to making the future better. As Daniel settled into his role as a community leader and advisor to Mayor Whitman, he found a sense of purpose that fueled his passion for reform. However, the shadows of the past were never too far away. Each year, as the anniversary of the incident approached, Daniel felt the weight of it all pressed down on him. He had made significant strides, both personally and in the community, but reminders of his past mistakes haunted him in quiet moments. One evening, while preparing for a panel discussion on police reform, Daniel received an unexpected phone call. It was from a journalist named Lisa Chong, who had been following the developments in Westbridge since the incident with Whitman. She wanted to interview him about the progress made under Whitman's administration and his own journey of redemption. Daniel hesitated. He had spoken to journalists before, but this felt different. He was no longer just the cop who had made a terrible mistake, he was also an advocate for change. Could he articulate that effectively? After a moment's thought, he agreed to the interview, hoping it would be an opportunity to share the lessons learned through pain and growth. The following week, Daniel met Lisa at a local cafe known for its vibrant atmosphere. As they settled into a quiet corner, she began the interview with questions about the reforms in Westbridge and the impact they had had on the community. "What has been the most significant change you've witnessed since Whitman took office?" she asked, her pen poised above her notebook. Daniel thought for a moment, recalling the various initiatives, community meetings, and outreach programs that had sprung up over the years. "I think the most significant change has been the shift in how the community perceives the police," he said. "We're seeing officers engaging with citizens, not as enforcers but as members of the community. That's a huge step forward." Lisa nodded, encouraging him to continue. "And how do you feel about your role in all of this? You've become quite a prominent figure in the discussion around police reform." Daniel shifted in his seat, unsure how to answer. Honestly, I never sought out this role. I just wanted to help the kids at the community center, to make a difference in their lives. But as I became more involved, I realized that my experiences, both as a police officer and as someone who has faced the consequences of a terrible mistake, give me a unique perspective. Do you believe your past still influences how people see you? Lisa probed gently. Yes, I think it does. Some people view me as a cautionary tale, while others see me as a testament to change. It's a complex relationship, but I can't deny that my past mistakes have shaped who I am today. It's a constant reminder that we're all capable of growth, no matter how far we fall. As the interview continued, Daniel found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated. Lisa asked about the struggles and victories of the reform process, and he shared stories of young people at the community center who had turned their lives around with guidance and support. He spoke passionately about the importance of mentorship, of listening to the voices of those who felt unheard. By the end of the conversation, Daniel felt a sense of catharsis. Lisa had a way of drawing out the deeper truths within him, and he realized that sharing his story could help others who were grappling with their own pasts. Thank you for your honesty, Daniel, Lisa said as they wrapped up. Your perspective is invaluable. I think it's important for people to hear stories like yours, stories of redemption and hope. In the weeks following the interview, the article was published, and it quickly gained traction. Daniel's story resonated with readers across the country, and he received messages from individuals who had faced their own struggles, people who were looking for hope amid their pain. It was both humbling and empowering. Daniel realized that sharing his journey had the potential to inspire others to confront their pasts and strive for a better future. Encouraged by the positive feedback, Daniel decided to take his advocacy a step further. He approached Whitman with an idea for a community event, a summit focused on police reform and community engagement, where citizens could voice their concerns, share their experiences, and work collaboratively with law enforcement to shape a safer, more equitable future. Daniel, that's a fantastic idea, Whitman said, his eyes lighting up. We've been looking for ways to bring the community and the police together more effectively. This could be the catalyst we need. Together, they began planning the event, reaching out to local organizations, activists, and residents. The summit would serve as a platform for open dialogue, allowing community members to express their thoughts and feelings while also giving police officers a chance to listen and learn from those they served. The day of the summit arrived, and excitement buzzed in the air. The venue was packed, with community members, police officers, and city officials all gathered to engage in meaningful discussions. Daniel felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as he stood on the stage, ready to address the audience. Thank you all for being here today, he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. This is a critical moment for our city. We're not here just to discuss what has happened in the past, but to shape the future we all want to see. As Daniel spoke, he saw familiar faces in the crowd. Some were young people he had mentored at the community center, others were community leaders who had been vocal advocates for reform. They had all come together, united by a shared vision of a better Westbridge. The summit featured a series of panels, breakout sessions, and discussions, with topics ranging from community policing to mental health resources for officers. There were moments of tension, moments where disagreements arose, but there was also a palpable sense of hope. Attendees engaged in candid conversations, sharing their personal experiences and proposing solutions to the challenges they faced. During one of the breakout sessions, Daniel led a group of community members and officers in a discussion about the barriers to trust. A young woman named Sarah, a lifelong resident of Westbridge, spoke passionately about her experiences growing up in a neighborhood that felt targeted by law enforcement. I just want to feel safe in my own community, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But every time I see a police car, I feel scared, not protected. The officers in the room listened intently, and Daniel could see their expressions shift as they absorbed her words. It was moments like this that made the summit worthwhile, raw, honest conversations that could lead to real change. As the day came to a close, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. The summit had been a success, and the feedback from both community members and law enforcement was overwhelmingly positive. People were eager to continue the dialogue, to build on the connections that had been made that day. In the weeks that followed, discussions stemming from the summit continued. Whitman's administration committed to ongoing community engagement, and they began to implement some of the ideas generated during the event. Daniel played an active role in these initiatives, acting as a liaison between the community and the police department. Despite the progress, Daniel remained grounded in the reality of his past. Each time he spoke publicly or engaged in discussions about reform, he was reminded of the incident that had forever changed his life. But rather than shying away from it, he embraced it as part of his narrative, a narrative that could serve as a powerful reminder of the potential for growth and transformation. One evening, as Daniel prepared for another community meeting, he received a message from Lisa Chong, the journalist who had interviewed him months earlier. She wanted to feature the success of the summit in a follow-up article, highlighting the continued efforts in Westbridge to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Feeling a sense of pride, Daniel agreed to meet with her again. As they sat down in a familiar cafe, he reflected on how far he had come. From the darkness of his past to this moment, he had discovered a new purpose, one that allowed him to contribute to the very changes he had once thought were impossible. "Daniel, it's clear that your work is making a difference," Lisa said as she flipped through her notes. "What's next for you? What do you hope to achieve moving forward?" Daniel smiled, thinking about the journey ahead. "I want to continue to advocate for change, to help others find their voices. It's not just about me anymore, it's about all of us. I want to create spaces where people feel safe to share their stories and where those stories can lead to action. There's so much more work to do." Lisa nodded, capturing his words in her notes. "Your story is inspiring, and I think it's crucial for people to see that transformation is possible, even after a tragedy." As the conversation unfolded, Daniel felt a growing sense of clarity about his future. He envisioned a world where healing and understanding replaced fear and mistrust, a world where individuals could come together, regardless of their backgrounds or experiences, to work toward a common goal. As he left the cafe, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but he was ready to face whatever came next. With each step he took, he felt the weight of his past lesson, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. And in that moment, Daniel Harper understood that while he could never erase the mistakes of his past, he could continue to forge a path forward, one defined not by shame but by resilience, compassion, and hope. In the years that followed, Daniel remained a steadfast advocate for justice and reform. He developed programs aimed at mentorship for youth, focused on bridging the gap between communities and law enforcement. He worked tirelessly to foster understanding, reminding everyone he encountered that change was possible, no matter how far one had fallen. Eventually, Daniel became a key figure in a national movement for police reform, sharing his story at conferences and workshops across the country. He spoke to packed auditoriums, sharing the lessons learned from Westbridge and emphasizing the importance of listening to those affected by systemic issues. His passion and commitment resonated deeply with audiences, and he was often invited to participate in discussions about best practices for community engagement and police accountability. One day, while preparing for a speech at a major conference, Daniel received a phone call from Whitman. The mayor's voice was a mix of excitement and urgency. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. There's been a significant opportunity to expand our reform efforts, and I want you to be involved." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, intrigued. "We've been invited to collaborate with other cities that are experiencing similar challenges. This could be a chance to implement the lessons we've learned in Westbridge on a broader scale," Whitman explained. "I want you to help lead this initiative. Your voice is vital." Daniel's heart raced. The opportunity to influence change beyond Westbridge was both exhilarating and daunting. He thought about the countless individuals whose lives had been touched by the reforms in their community and how that momentum could create ripples of change across the nation. "Count me in," Daniel said, determination evident in his voice. As he traveled to other cities, meeting with leaders, activists, and community members, Daniel witnessed firsthand the struggles and triumphs of those advocating for change. Each community had its own unique challenges, but the underlying themes were often the same: the need for accountability, the desire for trust, and the belief that healing could come through dialogue. Daniel shared the story of Westbridge wherever he went, emphasizing the importance of collaborative efforts and the need to address systemic issues with empathy and understanding. He urged participants to engage with their communities, to listen to the voices of those who felt marginalized, and to prioritize relationship building over enforcement. Years passed, and as Daniel stood before a crowd at the annual National Police Reform Conference, he looked out at the faces of those who had joined him in the fight for change. He felt a surge of gratitude for the journey he had taken, for the lessons learned, and for the people he had met along the way. Today, we are not just discussing policies, we are creating a movement, he began, his voice strong and unwavering. This movement is built on the belief that change is possible. It is a movement fueled by the stories of those who have been affected by injustice and inequality. It is a movement that seeks to bring together communities and law enforcement in ways that foster understanding, compassion, and trust. The audience listened intently as Daniel spoke about the importance of unity, urging everyone to remember that they were all in this together, working toward a common goal. He shared stories of individuals who had found their voices, who had risen from their struggles to advocate for themselves and their communities. Change is not easy, but it is necessary, he concluded, his eyes shining with conviction. Together, we can create a future where every person feels safe, respected, and heard. Let us not forget that we are all capable of growth, transformation, and healing. As the applause erupted in the auditorium, Daniel felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he stood as a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of change. In that moment, surrounded by individuals who shared his vision, Daniel Harper knew that he was not just fighting for reform, he was part of a legacy that would continue to inspire future generations to challenge the status quo and strive for a better world. And so, the journey continued, not just for Daniel, but for all those who believed that healing was possible, that redemption was within reach, and that together, they could build a brighter future. As the years rolled on, Daniel Harper continued to play a pivotal role in the evolution of policing and community relations, not just in Westbridge but across the nation. The summit he had initiated became an annual event, drawing participants from various cities eager to share insights and strategies for reform. These gatherings turned into powerful platforms for voices that had long been marginalized, fostering a culture of openness and collaboration. In Westbridge, the changes were palpable. Crime rates decreased, but more importantly, trust levels between the police and community members rose steadily. Children who once viewed police officers as adversaries now saw them as mentors and allies. The police department, transformed by training and community engagement, became a model for others to emulate. Daniel found himself in a fulfilling rhythm, balancing his advocacy work with family life. He married Elena, a community organizer who shared his passion for justice, and together they welcomed 2 children into their lives. They often visited the community center, where Daniel introduced his children to the very youths he had once mentored. It was a beautiful circle of life, reflecting the growth and transformation he had witnessed throughout his journey. One day, during a quiet moment at home, Daniel sat down to write a letter to the young man he once was, the man who had made a terrible mistake. He poured out his heart, recounting the lessons learned from that fateful night and the path that had unfolded since then. He acknowledged the pain and regret, but also the hope and resilience that had emerged from those dark times. In the letter, he wrote, "Dear Daniel, you are not defined by your mistakes, but by how you choose to rise from them. Life has a way of testing our strength, but it also provides us with opportunities for growth and healing. Remember, every day is a chance to become better, to understand more, and to make a difference in the lives of others. Your journey is not just your own, it's a shared experience that has the power to inspire change and create a brighter future for many. Keep pushing forward, keep listening, and never underestimate the impact of compassion and understanding." As he sealed the letter, Daniel felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The journey had been long and often challenging, but it had also been filled with moments of connection, learning, and healing. The struggles had forged him into a better man and a stronger advocate for justice. With a heart full of hope and a mind focused on the future, Daniel knew that the fight for a just and equitable society was far from over. Yet, he also understood that change was not a destination, it was a continuous journey. Each step taken in the name of justice, each story shared, and each life touched was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As the sun set over Westbridge that evening, casting a warm glow over the city he loved, Daniel looked out at the horizon. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that while the past could never be changed, the future was still unwritten. And with each passing day, he would continue to strive for a world where healing and understanding reigned, a world where everyone had the chance to be heard, respected, and valued. In that shared commitment to change, Daniel Harper found his purpose, and in that purpose, he discovered a legacy that would endure far beyond his own journey, a legacy of hope, transformation, and the belief that together, they could build a better tomorrow.